What happens when one of Hollywood's most straight-talking actors comes face-to-face with a news anchor who thinks he can ambush him on live television? Well, you're about to find out, and trust me, this is one interview that went completely off the rails in ways nobody saw coming. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because this story is absolutely wild from start to finish. It was supposed to be a routine promotional interview. Mark Wahlberg was making the rounds for his latest action thriller, and Good Morning America was just another stop on the publicity tour. The producers had briefed George Stephanopoulos on the standard talking points, the movie plot, behind-the-scenes stories, maybe some light banter about Mark's workout routine. Simple stuff that fills airtime and keeps everyone happy. But George had other plans. As Mark settled into the interview chair, adjusting his jacket and checking his microphone, there was already something different in George's demeanor. The usual pre-interview small talk was notably absent. Instead, George shuffled through his notes with an intensity that seemed odd for what should have been a fluff piece about an action movie. "We're live in 30 seconds, the floor manager called out, and Mark flashed that trademark Wahlberg grin toward the camera, completely unaware that he was about to walk into an ambush. "Good morning, I'm George Stephanopoulos, and we're here with Mark Wahlberg." George began as the red light flicked on. His voice carried that practiced television smoothness, but there was an edge underneath that Mark immediately picked up on. "Mark, thanks for being here with us today." "Thanks for having me, George. Always good to be back on the show," Mark replied, his Boston accent giving his words that familiar cadence that audiences loved. He was relaxed, leaning back slightly in his chair, ready to talk about explosions and stunts. "Now, Mark, we're here to talk about your new film. But first I want to address something that's been making headlines," George said, and Mark's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The smile remained, but his eyes sharpened. "Oh yeah? What's that?" Mark asked, though his tone suggested he already knew this wasn't going where he expected. George leaned forward slightly, adopting that serious journalist posture that he was famous for. "There's been quite a bit of discussion about some of your past comments regarding various social issues. Comments that some people are calling problematic in today's climate." The studio fell silent except for the low hum of the cameras. Mark's jaw tightened just a fraction, but he kept his composure. "George, I'm here to talk about the movie. My publicist was very clear about what this interview was supposed to cover. Well, as journalists, we have a responsibility to address the issues that matter to our viewers," George pressed on, clearly not backing down. "And when someone with your platform makes statements that some consider controversial, don't you think the public deserves clarity?" Mark shifted in his seat, and anyone who knew him could see the warning signs. His hands, which had been casually resting on the chair arms, now gripped them slightly tighter. "What statements are we talking about exactly, George? Because I'm pretty sure I know my own words better than whoever's been twisting them for clicks." George consulted his notes with theatrical precision. "Well, for instance, your comments about certain political figures, your stance on law enforcement, your views on immigration. These aren't exactly fringe topics, Mark." "My views?" Mark's voice rose just slightly, still controlled but with an unmistakable edge. "George, are you seriously sitting there trying to gotcha me on live television with some out-of-context comments that probably came from some tabloid looking for controversy?" The tension in the studio was becoming palpable. Crew members exchanged glances, and the producers in the control room were likely having heart attacks. This was not the feel-good morning show content that Good Morning America was known for. "I'm simply asking you to clarify your positions on important issues that affect millions of Americans," George said, his voice taking on that sanctimonious tone that politicians and pundits use when they think they have the moral high ground. "Surely you can understand why people might want to hear directly from you on these matters." Mark stared at George for a long moment, and the silence stretched uncomfortably. When he finally spoke, his voice was deadly calm. "You know what, George? I think I understand exactly what's happening here. You brought me on this show under false pretenses, told my people we were talking about the movie, and now you're trying to turn this into some kind of political hit job. Mark, I hardly think asking for clarification on your public statements constitutes a hit job," George replied. But there was a slight tremor in his voice that suggested he was starting to realize he might have bitten off more than he could chew. "Public statements?" Mark laughed, but there was no humor in it. "George, when did you stop being a journalist and start being a prosecutor?" Because that's what this feels like right now. The interview was spiraling out of control, and everyone in the studio could feel it. Mark Wahlberg was not the kind of person who backed down from a fight, and George Stephanopoulos had just picked one with the wrong guy on live television. "I'm just doing my job, Mark," George said, trying to regain control of the situation. "Your job?" Mark leaned forward now, his famous intensity fully engaged. "Your job is supposed to be asking me about the movie I'm here to promote, not ambushing me with some political agenda that you've cooked up in your producer meetings." The camera operators were getting amazing footage, but this was the kind of train wreck that network executives have nightmares about. Good Morning America was supposed to be safe, family-friendly content that people watched over their coffee and toast. This was turning into something very different. George, perhaps realizing he had opened a door he couldn't close, tried to pivot. "Mark, I think you're being a bit defensive here. These are legitimate questions that any public figure should be prepared to answer." "Defensive?" Mark's eyebrows shot up, and his voice carried that dangerous quiet that people who knew him recognized as the calm before the storm. "George, let me tell you something about defensive. Defensive is what you're going to be when I walk out of here and tell everyone exactly what kind of ambush journalism you're running on this show." George's face flushed slightly at Mark's threat, but instead of backing down, he doubled down with the kind of arrogance that only comes from years of thinking you're untouchable behind a news desk. "Mark, I think you're overreacting here. This is how interviews work in the real world. We ask questions, you provide answers." "The real world?" Mark's voice dropped to that low, dangerous register that anyone from Boston would recognize as trouble brewing. "George, let me tell you about the real world. In the real world, when someone lies to get you somewhere, we call that fraud. When someone ambushes you on television, we call that being a snake." The control room was in complete chaos at this point. Producers were screaming into headsets. Directors were frantically trying to figure out if they should cut to commercial, and the network executives, who were probably just sitting down with their morning coffee, were about to have their day completely ruined. "I resent the implication that I've been dishonest," George said, his voice taking on that wounded tone that politicians use when they've been caught red-handed but want to play the victim. "Everything I'm asking you about is part of the public record." "Public record?" Mark laughed again, and it was even less pleasant than before. "George, you want to talk about public record? Let's talk about your public record. Let's talk about how you were a political operative before you became a journalist, if we can even call what you do journalism." That hit home. George's face went from flushed to pale in about 2 seconds. "My background is irrelevant to this conversation, Mark." "Oh, it's irrelevant now?" Mark was warming up, and when Mark Wahlberg got warmed up, things tended to get very interesting very quickly. "It's irrelevant that you spent years spinning for politicians and now you sit behind this desk pretending to be some objective news guy? Give me a break, George. I've been a respected journalist for over 2 decades. George shot back, his composure finally starting to crack. "I don't need to defend my credentials to someone who makes action movies for a living." The studio went dead silent. Even the camera operators stopped moving. George had just made a massive mistake, and everyone in the building knew it except apparently George himself. Mark stared at him for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was ice cold. "Someone who makes action movies for a living? Is that really how you want to play this, George?" "I didn't mean it like that." George started to backpedal, but it was too late. The words were out there, captured on live television, and Mark Wahlberg was not the kind of person who let disrespect slide. "No, no, no. You said it, so let's talk about it," Mark said, leaning forward in his chair. "You think because you wear a suit and read off a teleprompter that makes you better than someone who actually works for a living? Someone who creates jobs for hundreds of people every time he makes one of those action movies? Mark, I think we're getting off track here." George tried desperately to regain control, but the train had already left the station and was picking up speed. "Off track? George, this is exactly on track. This is what happens when you try to ambush someone and then look down your nose at them like you're somehow superior." Mark's Boston accent was getting thicker, always a sign that his temper was rising. "You sit here in your little bubble, making your little judgments, thinking you can just attack people, and they'll take it because you're on television." "I wasn't attacking you, I was asking legitimate questions," George protested, but his voice lacked conviction now. Legitimate questions? Mark's eyebrows shot up again. George, if these were legitimate questions, why didn't your people mention them when they booked me? Why did they tell my publicist this was about the movie? You want to know what legitimate questions look like? Mark shifted in his chair, fully engaged now like a boxer who had found his range. Here's a legitimate question, George. How do you sleep at night knowing that you make a living lying to people? How do you look at yourself in the mirror every morning knowing that you've turned journalism into some kind of political hit squad? George's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. This was not how interviews were supposed to go, especially not on Good Morning America. Mark, I think you need to calm down. Calm down? Mark's voice rose for the first time, and several crew members actually took a step back. George, you just spent the last 10 minutes trying to destroy my reputation on live television. And now you want me to calm down? You think this is some kind of game? It's not a game, it's journalism, George said weakly. Journalism? Mark stood up from his chair, and the camera operators scrambled to adjust their shots. George, journalism is supposed to be about truth, about fairness, about giving people information they need. What you're doing isn't journalism, it's character assassination. The floor manager was making frantic hand signals, trying to get someone, anyone, to do something before this got even worse, but there was no stopping it now. Mark Wahlberg was in full combat mode, and George Stephanopoulos was learning what it meant to pick a fight with someone who didn't play by television rules. You came on this show voluntarily, George said, trying one last desperate attempt to turn the tables. Nobody forced you to be here. Voluntarily? Mark's laugh was harsh and bitter. George, I came here because your people told me we were going to talk about a movie. Instead, you turned it into some kind of political inquisition. You lied to get me here, you ambushed me on camera, and now you're trying to make it sound like this is my fault? I'm simply trying to do my job, George repeated, but he sounded like a broken record at this point. Your job? Mark took a step closer to the desk, and George actually leaned back in his chair. Your job is supposed to be informing the public, not carrying water for whatever political agenda you're pushing this week. Your job is supposed to be about integrity, something you clearly know nothing about. The tension in the studio was so thick you could cut it with a knife. This was no longer an interview, it was a confrontation, and everyone watching knew that something historic was happening. This was the moment when a Hollywood star decided he'd had enough of media manipulation and fought back in the most public way possible. George tried to salvage what was left of his authority, straightening his tie and adopting that stern voice he used when interviewing politicians. Mark, I'm going to have to ask you to sit back down and conduct yourself appropriately, or we'll have to end this interview. That was the wrong thing to say to Mark Wahlberg, and George was about to learn that lesson the hard way. End the interview? Mark's eyes flashed with something that made several crew members take another step back. George, you think you're in control here? You think because you're sitting behind that desk with your little nameplate that you get to dictate terms to me? This is my show, George said, but his voice cracked slightly on the word show. Your show? Mark's voice was deadly quiet now, which was somehow more intimidating than when he was shouting. George, let me explain something to you about shows. A show requires an audience that respects the host. Right now, everyone watching this train wreck is seeing exactly what kind of person you really are. George looked around desperately at his producers, but they were all frozen like deer in headlights. This had gone so far beyond anything they had protocols for that nobody knew what to do. You want to talk about conducting myself appropriately? Mark continued, his voice building momentum like a locomotive. Let's talk about appropriate conduct, George. Is it appropriate to lie to someone's representatives about what an interview will cover? Is it appropriate to ambush a guest with political questions when they came here to talk about their work? Mark, please, George tried to interrupt, but Mark was just getting started. No, George, you don't get to please me now. You had your chance to be professional, and you blew it. You want to know what's really inappropriate? What's inappropriate is using your position as a news anchor to push your own political agenda. What's inappropriate is pretending to be objective when everyone knows you're just another partisan hack with a television show. The control room was in absolute pandemonium. Someone was screaming about cutting to commercial. Someone else was yelling about legal implications. and the director was probably having a nervous breakdown. But the cameras kept rolling because nobody had the authority or the courage to pull the plug. "I am a professional journalist," George said weakly, like he was trying to convince himself as much as the audience. "Professional?" Mark's laugh was harsh and mocking. "George, professionals don't lie to get people on their shows. Professionals don't ambush their guests. Professionals have something called integrity, which is apparently a foreign concept to you." George made one final desperate attempt to regain control. "Mark, if you can't handle tough questions, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews." The studio went so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Mark stared at George for what felt like an eternity, and when he finally spoke, his voice was so low and dangerous that it made the hair on everyone's arms stand up. "Tough questions?" Mark repeated slowly, like he was tasting the words. "George, you think these were tough questions? You want to see tough questions? Here's a tough question for you. How do you explain to your viewers that you're nothing but a political operative pretending to be a journalist?" "That's not true," George protested, but his voice was barely above a whisper now. "It's not true?" Mark's voice exploded through the studio like a thunderclap. "George, everyone knows what you are. Everyone knows you're just carrying water for whatever political machine is paying your bills this week. You sit here pretending to be some kind of neutral news guy, but you're about as neutral as a campaign commercial." George tried to stand up, perhaps thinking that would help him regain some authority, but Mark was having none of it. "Sit down, George," Mark said with such quiet intensity that George actually did sit back down. "You wanted to play games, so let's play games. You want to ambush people? Let's talk about ambushes. You want to ask tough questions? Let's ask some tough questions." Mark started pacing behind his chair now, like a lawyer addressing a jury. "Here's a tough question, George. When did you decide that journalism was about destroying people instead of informing them? When did you decide that lying to guests was an acceptable way to get them on your show?" "I never lied," George said desperately. "You never lied?" Mark spun around to face him directly. "George, your people told my publicist this interview was about my new movie. We have the emails. We have the phone calls. Are you telling me that asking about alleged controversial political statements is the same thing as talking about an action movie?" George opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was trapped, and he knew it. "That's what I thought," Mark said with grim satisfaction. "You can't answer, because there is no answer. You lied to get me here, you ambushed me on camera, and now you're trying to play the victim when I call you out on it." The floor manager was making increasingly frantic signals, but nobody seemed to know what to do. This was live television, and they couldn't just make it stop. "You want to know what the real problem is, George?" Mark continued, his voice carrying the weight of genuine anger now. "The real problem is that people like you have turned journalism into a joke. You've turned it into political theater, where the truth doesn't matter as long as you can score points against whoever you've decided to target. That's not what happened here." George tried one more time, but even he didn't sound convinced. "That's exactly what happened here." Mark slammed his hand down on George's desk, making the coffee mug jump and spill. "You brought me on this show under false pretenses, you tried to ambush me with gotcha questions, and when I fought back, you acted like I was the one being unreasonable." George flinched at the sound of Mark's hand hitting the desk, and for the first time in the interview, he looked genuinely scared. "You know what, George?" Mark straightened up and looked directly into the camera. "I came here to talk about a movie that hundreds of people worked incredibly hard to make. A movie that's going to entertain millions of people and provide jobs for thousands more. But instead of talking about that, you decided to turn this into some kind of political hit job." He turned back to George, who looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. "So here's what's going to happen, George. I'm going to walk out of here, and you can explain to your viewers why your show just became a joke. You can explain to them why you thought it was more important to play political games than to actually do journalism." Mark started to remove his microphone, but he wasn't done yet. "And George, next time you want to ambush someone, make sure you pick someone who's not going to fight back. Because this," he gestured around the studio, "this is what happens when you mess with the wrong person." The producers were screaming into their headsets now, probably getting orders from network executives who were watching their careers flash before their eyes. Someone finally found the courage to make a decision. "We're going to commercial," a voice shouted from the control room, but Mark was already walking toward the exit. "Yeah, you go to commercial, George," Mark called over his shoulder. "Take all the time you need to figure out how you're going to explain this disaster to your bosses." George sat at his desk, looking shell-shocked, as Mark disappeared through the studio doors. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every second of what would become one of the most talked-about television moments in recent memory. "Ladies and gentlemen," George finally managed to say to the camera, his voice shaky and uncertain, "we'll be right back after this commercial break." But everyone watching knew that Good Morning America would never be quite the same after Mark Wahlberg had just exposed everything that was wrong with modern television journalism in the most spectacular way possible. So what do you think? Was Mark Wahlberg justified in walking out on George Stephanopoulos? Or should he have just played along with the ambush? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, hit that subscribe button for more stories like this, and let me know what other celebrity confrontations you want to hear about next.